Hear, O earth and heavens, I will weep many tears for the destruction of thousands. From the day I left Jerusalem, there will be an especially great wail for the year 1391 in the original Hebrew Kano, Kof Nun Aleph. For the community of Seville was destroyed and many communities in Castile. The communities of the people of Andalusia and Provincia were struck by evil. Catalonia was disgraced together with Aragon. The poet Dan Yehuda ben David Negro Ibn Yahya wrote this and several other elegies to mark the tragic events of the summer of 1391. Anti-Jewish riots erupted all over Spain. The Spanish Inquisition came into effect almost 100 years later, the Edict of Expulsion in 1492. But to understand this topic, we need to start with the tragic year of 1391, and maybe even a little bit earlier. Why am I giving this lecture? Several years ago, I was asked to participate in an annual Spanish Inquisition remembrance ceremony. Some of the people on the Zoom may have been part of that. It was established by a group of individuals, largely of Mexican American heritage. And this group, many of them had very little contact with mainstream American Jewish life, so that the program they put together had bits and pieces that fit together in an interesting way. In fact, I would say the group wrestled with exactly how to describe their Jewish heritage, how to place their enthusiasm, and how to translate it into ceremonies and into activities with Jewish and cultural religious life. In-person ceremonies were cut down by COVID. Before 2020, we met in the Baba Yar Park in Denver. The organizers and their friends came out with artifacts and with maps and genealogies and folk art and images of the Tránsito Synagogue and all sorts of other things. Over the years, the ceremony was carefully thought out. It was my honor to offer the lecture several times, the keynote lecture of this event. I was not the only person to have been involved over the history of the ceremony. Rabbi David Zucker served as the MC, and his eloquence improved the entire ceremony. There was somebody who was appointed to read a list of all the tragedies that happened on Tisha B'Av. There was a Kaddish that was recited in the Sephardic form. Some of you may know with that paragraph and the next to last paragraph with a whole lot of extra things. It was recited in Spanish translation as well as in Aramaic, and in a format that paralleled the Holocaust Mourners College, Mourners Kaddish that some of you may be familiar with. This is the one that goes Yitkadal, Auschwitz, V'yishkadat, Birkenau, and so on and so forth. Many Yom HaShoah rituals have a musical selection, and the organizers of this eventually decided they should have one as well. There was some irony in that the organizers decided that the chief organizer would sing. She had a beautiful voice, and she sang the Yiddish song Zog Maran. Composer was Shmuel Bugach. The poem was by Avram Reisen. And this was a popular song in workmen's circle families for Passover, because it tells about a crypto-Jewish family who observes Passover in secret in a cave, and they have a Haggadah which they hide in a little cubbyhole in the cave, and they would fight for their Jewish identity to the death. Now, I think it's ironic because Sarah Ruth objected to the M word, to Marano. And I also think she chose to sing in Yiddish to an audience that was largely Spanish speaking. Make of it what you want. I think it was very moving. This year, the ceremony is on pause. I'm not going to recreate the entire ceremony, but I am continuing in the tradition of offering a lecture during the 3 weeks, and especially during the 9 days, because the expulsion from Spain took place on I should say, became effective on the 31st of July, which is the 7th of Av, and one of the many things that we lament on Tisha B'Av, the 25-hour fast. I'm going to remind you that I'm going to fix up the lecture, give it with illustrations on September 15th. How did Jews come to Spain? Well, we have traditions that Jews came to Spain already in the time of the destruction of the First Temple or earlier, but we only have records of the Jews in Spain from late Roman times, but the 3rd and 4th century is still pretty early. We know that Jews had persecutions in Visigothic Spain, that's before the Islamic conquest, but in general, they lived in peace after the Muslims came to Spain in 711 Christian era. And in point of fact, some people say they lived in peace in large part because they helped the Muslim armies against the Visigoths and eventually also the Roman Catholic kings of Spain. Some of the Jews of Spain rose to great heights in terms of not only their intellectual and philosophical achievements, but also their political and financial achievements. The example from the early period that most comes to mind is Shmuel Nagid, 11th century. He led the armies of Granada and wrote poetry in Hebrew about how he conducted wars for his benefactor. His son, however, Yehosef HaNagid, was deposed by anti-Jewish riots in 1066, the first inkling of what might be coming centuries later. 2 centuries before, there were wide-scale conversions to Catholicism in Spain. The Almohades, the Almohadun in Arabic, came into Spain in the 1140s, and their terror caused the many Jews to convert to Islam. We have an Arabic biography of doctors, which asserts that Moses Maimonides and his son Abraham Maimonides were among the people who converted to Islam because of the Almohad invasion. And it makes plenty sense based on some of the things that Rambam wrote. I don't know whether he actually did, but that's the report. Pressure on the Jewish communities increased in the 1200s, possibly in the Christian Spain because the Almohads, the Muslims, were thrown out, and the Christians no longer had the Muslims to be their big enemy, so they turned to the Jews. Alfonso el Sabio, the Wise, ruled for much of the 1200s, and he's famous for his acceptance of Jewish courtiers, Jewish advisors, for his open attitude towards Judaism and so on, but we can already see the inklings of at least the legal basis for persecuting Jews. Many people in the Jewish world know that Ramban, Moshe ben Nachman, was persecuted by King Jaime, who was his friend, but also forced to have a disputation with an apostate Jew. And in 1271, when Nachmanides basically beat Pablo Cristiani in the debate, he was forced to leave because that was untenable in Christian Spain at that time. This is the 1200s. In the 1300s, the 14th century, things became much more complex. An atlas of Jewish life in Spain in the 14th century will show you many, many locations where there are anti-Jewish activities, but I'm only going to talk about one which I think is the most important, and for many people, the most striking. In the mid-1300s, Peter the Cruel, sometimes called Peter the Just, cruel or just depending on your politics, was the ruler of the combined monarchy of Castile and Leon. He ruled from 1350 to 1369. He was favorable to his Jewish subjects. Many of you may be aware of his Jewish protege, Shmuel ben Meir Halevi, from the famous Abulafia family. And Shmuel Halevi is most famous for his castle and his synagogue. Some of you may have visited his castle and his synagogue in the city of Toledo. El Greco Museum is almost for sure his castle, and El Tránsito Synagogue built 1355 to 1357, most likely was built at his initiative and with funding that he got from his work for the king. The Abulafia family continued to serve the Spanish monarchs, and the synagogue continued to serve Toledo's Jews until the end of Jewish life in Toledo. But Shmuel ben Meir fell out of favor with Peter and was accused of embezzlement. He tortured and died, and he was tortured and he died in 1360. Had he not been imprisoned by his patron, his end may not have been any better, because Peter the Just or the Fool was engaged in a miserable civil war with his illegitimate half-brother Henry of Trastamara. Henry did not share Peter's policy of protecting Jews. There were massacres, there were mass conversions, and Benzion Netanyahu, the late father of the current prime minister of Israel, wrote at great length about the accusations of the conversos in Toledo of being marranos, pigs, because they retained some Jewish background. Jews were useful to the crown, so sooner or later the king attempted to limit the preaching of violence and the forced conversion of Jews. The House of Trastamara continued for about 2 centuries and continued its notorious, more often negative towards Jews than not, policies. Ferdinand and Isabel, for example, were descendants of Henry of Trastamara. They were only replaced with the Habsburg dynasty of Charles V. What happened in 1391? Already at the end of 1370s, a priest called Ferran Martinez began preaching against the Jews and called for their expulsion and for the destruction of Jewish synagogues. The church and the king both protected the Jews. But in 1390, the Archbishop of Seville died, and Juan I, King of Castile, died. And Martinez seized the opportunity. June 6, 1391, corresponding with Rosh Chodesh Tammuz, the riots in Seville broke out and turned deadly. I don't know how reliable the reports are from those days. They didn't have the New York Times or the Intermountain Jewish News to give you accurate reports. 4,000 Jews were murdered in Seville, according to some of them. The traditional notion is that the riots spread to some 70 cities throughout the Iberian Peninsula. They came to Barcelona, for example, on the 7th of Av. By Rosh Hashanah, 3 months after the 1st of Tammuz, the figures ran into the tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of Jews who were murdered or raped by the mobs or converted to Christianity. In Valencia, for example, on the Mediterranean shore, 90% of the Jewish community of 2,500 souls was reportedly murdered or forcibly converted. The King of Aragon was able to protect the Jews in Saragossa, but not in Barcelona. Some of the figures are as high as 200,000 Jews converted to Catholicism. It's often thought that over half of the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula were murdered or converted at this time. The lucky ones were able to flee. Old Christians did not always welcome the new converts. Some of them worried that the new Christians were successfully competing against their own traditional interests and sources of income. My recollection of the elder Netanyahu's description of Toledo was that that was one of their big complaints. The new Christians were able to get into some of the jobs that the old Jews were prohibited from. Some became true Christians. The most famous example is Shlomo Halevi of Burgos, who became a bishop. He urged Jews and conversos to join Christianity as true believers, and even wrote that he was proud of his heritage. He was by the law of Christ by faith, but the family of Jesus by flesh. The antagonism to limpieza de sangre, the purity of blood. People were not able to show that their grandparents were all old Catholics. That was still in the future, in the end of the 1300s, beginning of the 1400s. At the end of the 14th century, in 1400, 1399, it's hard to know how many new Christians there were. The figure that I have in front of me now as being as likely as any other was 200,000 or more. The 1400s were no better. Vicente Ferrer is said to have single-handedly converted 25,000 Jews from the 1390s to his death in 1419. 1412 is remembered Ka'ov, Kof Ayin Bet, as being a year that was particularly bad with riots in Valencia and other locations. I'm going to fast forward to the end of the 1400s. The problems that we read about in the Alhambra proclamation, the proclamation by the Catholic kings to remove the Jews from Spain, give us a picture that the Jews were problematic for the persons of Jewish ancestry who were living in their midst. What did the Catholic monarchs accuse them of? Well, you could get kosher meat if you went down the road to your old butcher. That's not how they wrote it, but they were telling them, well, here's kosher meat, or they were advising them, well, you know, our grandparents lit candles on Shabbat night. How do we do that? They were telling them how to do Jewish things. They were inviting them to return to Judaism and so on. There's a long list of things that they talked about. This was bothersome to them, and they appealed to the Pope. And in 1478, Pope Sixtus IV proclaimed that there could be a Spanish Inquisition in 1480. The first autos da fe under this Inquisition were in 1481. About this time, the Catholic monarchs introduced a kind of trial separation. They removed the Jews from close proximity to Catholics in Andalusia, in the south of the country. During this time, the southwest part of Spain was still nominally Muslim. The tributary state ruled by Boabdil was conquered by the Catholic monarchs in January of 1492, and Boabdil was forced to retreat to North Africa. In any case, the purpose of the Inquisition was to enforce the sincerity of Christian belief and to root out crypto-Judaism, in this case, Judaizing, explicit Jewish practice, and belief among Christians of Jewish heritage. And Christians who were not of Jewish heritage or had the same Judaizing would probably also have been in trouble. Although the Inquisition could have and eventually did deal with all sorts of other problematic things, during the first period of activity from 1481, depending on where, until the middle of the 1500s and until the 1650s in Mexico, typically 90 to 99.9% of the proceedings concerned Judaizing. The symbolic role as an oppressor of persons of Jewish heritage informs much of the modern resurgence of identification with Jewish heritage among persons of Spanish ancestry. Its successes were very real and they were very quickly apparent. Within 3 years, Pope Sixtus was already condemning the excesses of the Spanish Inquisition. Well, Ferdinand and Isabella, these two relatively young descendants of Henry of Trastamara, their grandparent, I believe, Juan I of Castile, they married in 1469, and they tried to unify their realm. They not only unified Aragon and Castile, which had fallen to them, and Leon and so on, everything except for Portugal, but they also thought that unifying the realm under a religious banner would be a useful thing. They got rid of the Muslims, and then they were going to get rid of the Jews. Some people see the excessive influence of specific churchmen, not only Tomas de Torquemada, but there are a number of other churchmen who are mentioned. Some people see that imposing the Inquisition was an attempt to control and moderate some of the excesses of late medieval society. The inquisitors conducted formal trials with rules, with regulations, and while modern standards don't make these trials particularly democratic and just, you have to remember that justice in the late 15th century had torture, and they had trial by drowning and all sorts of other types of things. And, the Inquisition only used torture to extract confessions in which they had already concluded guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, after they had already reached the sentence. They also kept careful records, which was not the case in justice otherwise. The other thing to know is that very often the people who were imprisoned were absolved and exonerated. First offenders could be reconciled or penanced and go back to living their lives. Offenders also could say, well, all those people who accused me, they're all my enemies. This one is my business. We used to be in business together, and I fired him, and he's trying to get back at me and things like that. And there came to be lawyers who knew what to say to the Inquisition. And again, compared to late medieval justice, or compared to, for example, justice in the Soviet Union or in contemporary Iran, it was relatively just. Part of the reason I go over this is because I have heard over and over and over again about how the Inquisition made my ancestors Catholic. It's probably true that the Inquisition made their ancestors believing Catholics because it was impossible to be anything else. But conversion to Catholicism happened in the 1300s or 1391. Conversion to Catholicism happened all during the 1400s, or it happened because either people were stuck in Spain and couldn't get out in 1492, or they went to Portugal and were converted by force by the king. It's good to keep these things into perspective. One more thing, we talk about the Inquisition had autos da fe in which they killed their victims. Strictly speaking, the Inquisition was the church and it was the crown that did the executions. They transferred, the Latin term is relaxare, so you sometimes see the word relaxed to the crown, but it was the state that killed the victims of the Inquisition. I guess another reason to mention this is that way back in the 500th anniversary of the expulsion from Spain, people talked about having an apology from King Juan Carlos himself, remembering that it was not simply the church, but it was the crown that had set up the Inquisition and had, strictly speaking, been responsible for the executions. The other thing to remember about the Inquisition is that it was very, very effective at torturing and at preventing Judaizing and making it very difficult for Jews to transfer Jewish heritage from one generation to the next. But the entire number of persons of Jewish heritage who were killed in the entire history of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition is often estimated to be around 3,000 or fewer, a lot less than the estimates of Jews murdered in the riots of 1391 alone. Let's put this in perspective, though, folks. Terrorists can kill 3,000 Jews in the World Trade Center, or they can kill and take hostages in the Otef Aza in the Gaza envelope on October 7th of this past year and have a tremendous, tremendous effect. Think of all the things that have changed because of these relatively small scale acts of terror. I'm going to skip ahead to the rest of the lecture to try to complete it within 40 to 45 minutes and have some time for questions. Inquisition came to the New World. It didn't come immediately to Mexico. Mexico, I should say, New Spain was discovered in 1492, and there were Spaniards who were living in Mexico early in the 1500s. It took until the middle of the 1500s for the Inquisition to be established with any kind of clarity in New Spain. And it was not really until the 1570s in which it happened. Their most famous victims were a small group of people surrounding the figure of Luis de Carvajal Mozo, the younger Luis de Carvajal, who knew nothing about his Jewish ancestry, but was thrown into jail and began to research it, learning everything he could from the very limited number of books that he could obtain. But he and some of his sisters and some members of the extended family and friends were able to learn quite a bit. And we have records of how they did what they could to observe not only the fast of Esther, which was very popular, and fast of Esther probably was not the day before Purim. It was some day that they determined. And El Gran Dia, the fast of Yom Kippur. The good thing about fasting is that you don't have to tell anybody you're not eating. You don't have to go sit in the synagogue and pray instead of going to work and things like that. And you don't even have to tell them you're fasting because it's a Jewish practice. But Luis de Carvajal also discovered practices with some of the other Jewish holidays, and members of his entourage would get together for holidays like Passover and Sukkot. There's an interesting story about the Sukkah celebration of 1603 in the Carcel Perpetual, the perpetual prison of the headquarters of the Inquisition in Mexico City. Carefully disguised. They didn't want them to think they were Jewish, so there was pork on the table. But they did it outside, and they had some of the symbols that were meant to show the participants that they knew something about the festival of Sukkot. There were Inquisition locations in Lima, in Cartagena, in Buenos Aires, in the Philippines, in Lisbon, the Portuguese Inquisition in Lisbon, in Brazil, in Goa, and a number of other places. The Lisbon Inquisition dealt with Jews a lot later, in part because of the history. Jews were able to retain Jewish identity in Portugal for a lot longer. Statistics developed by the late David Gitlitz suggest to me, or suggested to him actually, that most of the individuals who are able to transmit Jewish heritage to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, even if it was only a small percentage, maybe 40 or 50% in the first generation, but by the third generation, only one or two descendants. Most of them had some kind of connection with the areas of Portugal in which one could retain Jewish practice for quite some time after 1497. So I think it's important to talk about the legacy of the Inquisition today. It's somewhat obvious for Jewish history, the golden age of Spanish Jewish thinking, Spanish Jewish writing on halakha, Jewish law, on culture, on all sorts of things, produced a massive amount of really first-rate works of tremendous importance. I mentioned Maimonides, I mentioned Nachmanides. I could easily have mentioned a dozen other people, Judah Halevi, Abraham ibn Ezra, his brother Moshe ibn Ezra, Hastai Kreskas. The list goes on and on. That center disappeared. It disappeared almost overnight because the Jews were able to function as Jews, were able to write and produce until the end of the 1400s. And then they went into exile. 1391 may have been the event that spearheaded a change in the openness of Kabbalah. We read about Kabbalistic stuff in guys like Moshe and Nachmanides. We know very little about it. That generation, the generation of Moshe Delon and Nachmanides in the late 1200s, developed Kabbalah and publicized it. But it was 1391 and especially 1492 that allowed for the dissemination of Kabbalah as we know it today beyond the borders of Spain. The most important 16th century, 1500s Kabbalist was the Ari, the Ashkenazi Rabbi Yitzhak, Isaac Luria, but he was functioning in Safed amongst a group that was largely Sephardic, and many of whom had Spanish background, and some, like the Mechaber, had been born in Spain, although he left very young. Joseph Caro left Spain when he was 4 years old and probably had very little memory of it. But the impact of the Spanish dispersion is immense. Today, we have the impact of many individuals who are finding their Jewish heritage, and the numbers here are tremendous. I've been looking at some of the DNA reports. And I saw Bennett was on our Zoom. He is much more of an expert than I am. But you will figure that 20% of Y chromosomes have some marker that's associated with Judaism. 20% of the male-only line has a Jewish marker. Imagine the amount of people with Jewish heritage when it's not only limited to the male Jewish line. I figure that 100 years ago, very few Spaniards would have talked about Jewish heritage. And there's actually a footnote to 100 years ago, which I'll get into in a moment. Whereas today, many, many persons of Spanish heritage are quite aware that the part of Toledo or the part of Barcelona that their families lived in was actually a Jewish quarter. 1924, 100 years ago, was actually an interesting and important year. That year was the first year in which the Spanish government had some sort of an opening towards returning Jewish identity. A law was enacted, I understand it's still on the books, which allows for persons of Sephardic heritage to have a kind of birthright citizenship. It's not the rule that was enacted in the past 10 years. It's a little bit more complicated in some ways, simpler if you happen to live in Spain. But before that time, there was very little. 1965, the church put out something called the Nostra Aetate, in our time, which opened up the church activity, the church's openness towards Jews and Muslims, and was really an earth-shaking change in how the Catholic Church looked at non-Catholics in general, including Protestants. Within 3 years, Franco had allowed some Jewish communities to return to Spain. They had probably been there before. I certainly have met people who were Jews living in at least some places in Spain whose parents had lived in Spain before 1968, but it was only at that point that it became legal to be a Spanish Jew. And of course, things changed rapidly in 1975. I want to begin winding down, so a few final comments. Today, during the 9 days, during Tisha B'Av, many congregations will have an elegy, a kinah, about the 6 million Jews destroyed in the Holocaust and their readings for this day. In some Sephardic communities, the riots of 1391, the expulsion of 1492 are remembered. And I have used a poem by Avraham ibn Ezra, Aha Yarad al Sfarad, that was from the time of the Almohades, the Almohads, the Mohadun, and the Murabitun, who made life miserable for the Jews in the 12th century and forced Rambam and Ibn Ezra to leave the country. Rabbi Stephen Leon and Rabbi Juan Mejia. Rabbi Leon wrote that he might join us. If you're here, it's a shout out to you. Published a booklet for the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism to facilitate remembrance of these events. And I think it's appropriate, and I think that the tear, the rip in the fabric of Judaism caused by the expulsion from Spain and the Inquisition in Spain and in all of Latin America, from southern Colorado south through Argentina. The rip in the fabric caused by the Inquisition is something that deserves to be remembered either on its own day of remembrance or on Tisha B'Av. I want to make one more comment, which I'm going to make, and I'm going to end with these things, and it's going to be more extemporaneous than my comments before. I wrote something about erasure of Judaism simply because this is a kind of discourse which is so very common today. What did I mean by that? Well, persons of hidden Jewish ancestry talk about how their Jewish heritage was erased from their memory by the Inquisition. I always found this a little bit strange from my point of view, because although my family was not a Arbeiterring, they're not labor Bundists and singing the Zod Maran, we talked about the heroism of Jews who kept Judaism in secret and did what they could to return to Judaism. When I was growing up in the 1950s and 1960s, this idea of fighting assimilation was very, very prevalent. Some of you may remember The World Over and journals like that. And this was something that we celebrated, but it was missing from the worldview of persons of Spanish heritage. And in this day and age, when we talk about erasing heritage, we talk about our Native Americans talk about the erasure of heritage and trying to recall it. Many other people talk about the erasure. So the African Americans also have a discourse like this. I think it's important to have both accurate facts and to have support for cultural awareness of the heritage. That's why I think that marking the, whatever you want to call it, the Inquisition, the expulsion, the terrible history of anti-Jewish riots in Spain, the erasure of Jewish life from the New World and the Spanish dominions. That's why I think that's also important today. Thank you very much for your attention. I have a few moments for questions, discussion, answers, and so on and so forth. And thank you all so much for joining me today.